The typical conventions of horror opening sequences include a dark setting, a person on their own or a group of people isolated, shots that portray a deathly atmosphere, a spiritual atmosphere, or some sort of eeriness, whether that be through silence, blood, or ghosts. There are lots of films I can mention that would easily fit into these categories one way or another. For example, The Woman in Black, one of the films I have analysed on my blog, portrays an eerie setting through the three little girls who are almost acting like robots, and the audio is very much leaning towards the possessive childlike feel. This is because of the soundtrack of a clockwork jewellery box that gradually gets scarier and scarier as the sequence progresses. In my opening sequence, I have portrayed many different conventions of the horror genre and opening sequences. The main convention of opening sequences, I believe, is to leave the audience wanting more, and I think the main way of doing that are enigma codes. I believe my opening sequence uses many enigma codes, like who is the possessed girl, why is the protagonist going to a church, or what happens to the protagonist next. Opening sequences are also supposed to give the audience an insight into what might happen in the film. In my opening sequence, I use my intertitles to suggest the main disruption in the film. On each of my intertitles and the one at the very end of the sequence, the writing reads, "Girl dies aged 13. This is to portray the fact that the antagonist is a girl who could be the sibling of the protagonist that is praying in the church. Similarly, in the science fiction horror World War Z, they open the film with many intertitles/overlay titles that include news reports about the disruption that happens later on in the film, which is where I got my inspiration from when making the newspapers for my opening sequence. The horror conventions in my opening sequence are very clear. I used a typical horror location, therefore I have used standard conventions of my genre, an old church, which religion is very important in horror films as it helps to reinforce the spiritual aspects to the antagonist's personality. I believe the effects on each shot is a typical horror look, as I used a dark luma keying filter with the saturation and exposure turned down slightly to reinforce other horror atmospheres. In the horror film Mirrors, the opening sequence has a dark blue-black tinge to the screen and creates a cold, deathly feel. To conclude question 1, I believe my sound also portrays conventions of the horror genre. It has a childlike, eerie feel to it through the nursery rhyme Twinkle Twinkle being sung by a young girl, the loud sound effects on the door slamming, and when the antagonist appears at the end. This is very similar to the soundtrack of The Woman in Black that I mentioned at the beginning because of the childlike feel it portrays. My media product challenges the typical conventions of horror as it does not include blood and guts right at the beginning, just like the film A Nightmare on Elm Street does, as it includes knives and a red tone to the shots suggesting blood and death.